We're going to review mean and standard deviation in this lesson. And we're going to do this in a somewhat of a manual method, and we'll actually see an easier way in a future lesson how to do these same calculations on a data set like this in pivot tables. And so one of the first things we're going to need to do is decide, what data we're looking for. And for this example, we'll just look at the child nutrition per pupil expenditures and the total. So we'll focus on column S for this example. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, so hopefully it's a little more clear on your screen. So when we're looking at the mean, we need the total sum, and we need to divide by the number of observations in. So we can find both of these. So the sum, we'll set this up, and we'll set the label here in cell U2, and we'll put the value in column V2. So we need the sum and we need the n. And so to get the sum, we can use the function equals sum and start the parentheses, and we want to get all the values in column S except for the last one. Remember, the last one is the state average, and that will be, and then we'll hit enter and it'll give us the sum. Another thing we may notice as we scroll down is we lost the header at the top, and we also can't see what's over in the first column, or actually the column C is what we want to see, the name of the school system. And so one way we can make sure we always see these is by using freeze panes. So it's possible to just freeze the top row, and that's in the view ribbon under freeze panes. So we can either freeze the top row or the top column. In this case, we want both the top row and the first three columns. So by placing the cursor in cell D2, we're going to get everything above and to the left of that to be frozen. And so we'll see if we go over now, we're going to maintain our first three columns so we can see our LEA names. And as we scroll down, we're going to be able to see our top row here to see the headings for those. So just a way to make it a little bit easier as we're doing things and make sure we select the correct values. For the n, we can use the count function. So this equals count, parentheses, and then we're going to select everything here that we're looking for. And again, we're only looking for the actual school system, so we're not going to grab that last cell, which is the state total. And so our n is 115. And another way we can see both of these, if you actually just highlight the data, Excel is thinking a little bit for us. So actually on the bottom of the screen here, we see the average is given, the count, and the sum. And so we've already added up the sum and the count in, and now we're going to calculate the mean, which is the sum, which is in cell V2, divided by the count, which is in cell V3, and hit enter, and we'll get a mean of $569.19. So the statewide, or the average of all school systems for child nutrition per pupil expenditures is $569.19, including state, federal, and local expenditures. Now let's calculate our variance and standard deviation. And we'll need to give ourselves a little more room, so I'm going to insert a column here to give us some space to do some intermediate calculations. And maybe also let me make sure I clarify some of our earlier calculations. When we're talking about the sum, this is the sum of child nutrition PPE total. It's always very important to be as specific as possible, so if you're ever reviewing these documents, it's easy to determine what we were using or what you were calculating previously. And again, this n is excluding the state total, and our mean is the mean for child nutrition PPE total, which is excluding the state total. So this is basically the mean for all school systems. So one of the intermediate steps we're going to need to calculate is the difference between an individual observation and our mean, and we're going to square that difference. So for our first value, it's going to be equals, and we're going to start with a parentheses because we're going to square this value, S2. We're going to subtract the mean, and we don't want that cell reference to change. Our mean is only in one cell, and since we're going to be dragging this equation down, we're going to need to add a $ before the 4, so when it gets drugged down, it's not going to change. It's also possible to add it in front of both the number and the column, so it can't change no matter how this equation is drugged. And then we're going to need to use our hat and the number 2 to square this value. And if we double click, we'll get to carry this equation down to the bottom. Now we don't want to include the state total, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that last value. We're not going to use that in our calculations for this example. So our intermediate calculation, so we're going to do the sum of our differences squared. This again was just an intermediate calculation, so we can calculate the variance in our next step. So this equals the sum of our column T values. And for the variance, we need to divide the sum of these differences squared by n-1. And this is, again, the child nutrition PPE total, excluding the state total. And so n-1 is our n of 115 minus 1, which is 114. So our variance is the sum of our differences squared divided by n-1. And so this is our variance for the child nutrition per pupil expenditures total. And we can get the standard deviation by taking the square root of our variance. And you can use the equation raising it to the hat to the 0.5, gives us the square root, or we can also use the equation or the function SQRT, and we're going to use that's of the variance, and those will give us the same value. So there are also built-in functions in Excel that will allow us to make these calculations much more quickly, and we'll also see when we're working with pivot tables that we can bypass this step. But this is how we would apply this if we weren't using pivot tables. So for the mean, and I'll put that we're using Excel for this, we're going to use the function average, so equals average. Start your parentheses, and we're going to select all of our data that we're interested in. And again, this is column S, but not including the state total. And we get the same mean that we manually calculated, so that's a good thing. These two numbers match. Next, we'll do the variance. And again, this is using Excel. And we're going to assume in this course that we're always looking at samples. Statistics are what we get from samples. If you had a population, we'd be looking at parameters. And so Excel gives us this choice. So for variance, it's equals var.s, s for sample. And we're going to select our data, our child nutrition PPE data excluding the state total. And we get the same variance that we calculated manually as well. And finally, standard deviation using Excel. And similarly, this is going to be looking at a sample, so it's stdev.s of our data. And we're going to get the same value. I'm going to format this as a number, and that matches with our manually calculated value. So these are the manual and Excel methods for calculating our mean, our variance, and our standard deviation for our child nutrition per pupil expenditures, and that's the total including state, federal, and local expenditures.